Some heroes don't wear medals. They carry mops. At Norfolk Tactical Center, a quiet single-dad janitor tries to live an invisible life until a proud USMC captain calls him a liar in front of an entire class. But when a high-ranking Navy admiral unexpectedly walks in, everything stops. Every soldier freezes. And the truth about this silent man begins to unfold piece by piece, revealing a past no one was prepared for. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartwarming stories of kindness, courage, and quiet heroes, feel free to join our channel. Your support helps us bring even more inspiring moments to life. The mornings at Norfolk Tactical Center always began the same way. Buzzing lights humming awake, the faint smell of old coffee drifting from the break room, and the muted clatter of keyboards from analysts who believed they held the world's pulse between their fingers. But every morning before any of them arrived, someone else was already there. Brian Hale. He moved through the quiet corridors with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had long ago learned the value of silence. His mop bucket rolled softly behind him, barely whispering across the tile. His long dark hair pulled back in a loose tie brushed the collar of his worn green fatigues. Not regulation, but no one bothered him enough to ask. Most didn't even look long enough. To them he was invisible, a janitor, a background shadow. But there was something different about him, something they never quite understood. The way his eyes swept a room sharp but tired. The way he paused briefly before entering any hallway, as if listening for something the rest of the world had forgotten how to hear. And none of them knew those habits were not born from routine, but from survival. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Brian entered Classroom 4B, an advanced simulation lab that, in a few hours, would host young Marines eager to prove themselves. Wide screens lined the walls, their dark surfaces reflecting fragments of his silhouette as he moved. His gaze lingered on one of the black screens. He didn't mean to. His eyes simply recognized patterns even when the screens were off. He drew a slow breath, forcing himself to look away. That was another life, not this one. He reached the last row of desks and began wiping down the surfaces. His movements were gentle practiced. He respected the space even if its occupants didn't respect him. From the doorway came a low scoff. "You missed a spot, Hale." Brian didn't turn immediately. He recognized the voice, sharp, overly confident, carrying the tone of a man who believed authority came from volume rather than integrity. Captain Henry Dalton. Dalton walked in with his hands behind his back, his posture perfectly straight, chin-high jaw, sharp enough to cut glass. His uniform looked like it had been pressed under a tank, metals gleaming bright enough to blind. Behind him trailed two young Marines, amused smirks already spreading across their faces. Brian simply nodded. "Morning, Captain." Dalton stepped closer, tapping one of the desks with his finger. "I said you missed a spot." Brian wiped the desk again, unbothered. Dalton's eyes narrowed. He wanted a reaction, something to validate his authority. Brian didn't give him one. "Tell me something," Hale. Dalton continued, circling him like a lion circling prey. "You ever get tired of this cleaning up after real soldiers?" One of the young Marines stifled a laugh. Brian kept wiping the desk. "It's honest work." "Sure," Dalton snorted. "Honest? Simple. Basic." Brian paused, not from offense, but from recognizing the same tone he'd heard 1,000 times, in 1,000 places. Men with something to prove were always louder than men who'd already proven enough. Finally, he looked up, meeting Dalton's eyes. "Everyone has a role, Captain." Dalton smirked. Big words for a janitor. Another laugh from the back. Brian ignored it and continued wiping, finishing the row. As the classroom filled with more Marines, Dalton kept glancing at Brian, ready to pounce at the smallest opportunity. Brian finished his cleaning, quietly gathering his bucket. But as he passed the simulation panels, He paused. One of the systems emitted a faint flicker, barely noticeable. A calibration error on the radar module. Nothing dramatic. But an error like that in a real combat simulation could cascade into a dozen miscalculations. Brian tilted his head slightly. They should check that before running the scenario, he thought. But he said nothing yet. He didn't want trouble. Not today. Still, as he walked past Dalton, he gently mentioned, "Captain, one of your radar modules seems off." Dalton turned slowly. "Oh." He crossed his arms. "And what makes you think you know anything about radar?" Brian offered a simple answer. "I've seen that error before." Dalton barked a laugh. Loud, mocking. "Yeah, right. You seen a tactical radar error." Several Marines joined the laughter. Brian didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply said, "Just thought you'd want to know." Dalton stepped closer, face inches away. "Listen carefully, Hale," he hissed. "I know your type. Guys who pretend they used to be someone. Guys who tell stories in bars to feel important. But in this room," he pointed a finger into Brian's chest, "you're nobody." A quiet filled the room. Brian didn't step back. He didn't rise to the challenge. His eyes held no anger, only distance, the kind that came from memories carved deep and permanently. "Understood, Captain," he said softly. Dalton smirked as if he'd won something. Brian left the classroom mop bucket rolling behind him. But as he stepped into the empty hallway, the overhead lights flickering gently above, he paused for a long moment. His jaw tightened, not from shame, but from restraint. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "It's just a job, Brian. Just a job." Then he exhaled slowly and continued down the corridor, disappearing into the quiet morning as the classroom behind him erupted in arrogant laughter. The world would soon learn that the quiet janitor they mocked was anything but ordinary. By noon, the Norfolk Tactical Center was alive with its usual storm of movement, doors slamming boots, striking tile bursts of hurried radio chatter. The air smelled faintly of metal pine scent cleaner and the tension of young Marines trying to compete with one another. Brian Hale kept to the edges of the hallway, pushing his cleaning cart with the practiced rhythm of someone who had long ago mastered the art of staying unnoticed. But even as he passed through the corridors, he felt eyes following him, whispers trailing behind like smoke. "There's the janitor captain," Dalton yelled at. "He thinks he knows radar, probably trying to impress people." None of the murmurs bothered him. Not anymore. Not after everything he'd lived through, everything he'd lost. Words couldn't wound a man who had already bled out his pride on battlefields no one here would ever see. Still, he couldn't shake one thought he hadn't wanted trouble. He only wanted to help, but people like Dalton never understood that. By 1 p.m., the classroom had filled again, lecture hall 4B, where Brian had cleaned just hours before. The digital screens glowed with complex tactical overlays. Dalton stood front and center, posture stiff, voice booming like he was addressing the entire Marine Corps rather than 20 young recruits. Brian entered quietly through the side door, simply to empty trash bins and wipe down a spill near the back row. Dalton noticed immediately. His eyes lit up with the same cruel amusement a schoolyard bully had when he spotted the smallest kid on the playground. "Well, well," Dalton said, loudly drawing the room's attention. "If it isn't our resident expert." A few Marines chuckled. Brian didn't respond, just continued wiping the desk. Dalton took a step closer, tilting his head mockingly. "You know Men Hale here wants us to believe he used to serve." He pointed at Brian as if presenting an exhibit. "He claims he's got tactical experience." Brian kept wiping. Dalton smirked. "Tell them, Hale. Tell them what great war stories you've got." Brian straightened slowly, not out of pride, but restraint. "I said I served, Captain. I didn't say anything more." Dalton barked a laugh that bounced off every glossy screen in the room. "Exactly. You served. What a convenient, vague word. You probably delivered mail. Or maybe you emptied trash at another base, too. More laughter. A couple of Marines shifted uncomfortably. Something in Brian's quiet dignity didn't quite match Dalton's version of him. But none were brave enough to say anything yet. Dalton folded his arms. Come on, indulge us. What unit were you supposedly in? Brian's voice remained calm. I was Special Operations. The room froze, not because they believed him, but because the janitor had dared say something so bold aloud. Dalton leaned forward slowly, savoring the moment like a wolf closing in. Special Operations. You. Brian nodded once. Not defensive, not proud, just factual. Dalton laughed so hard he had to steady himself on a desk. Men, listen to this. Our janitor was Special Ops. Maybe the CIA wants to recruit him next, the Marines roared. Except one, Corporal Jenkins, the young soldier who had watched Brian earlier. When he pointed out the radar error, felt a pinch of doubt. Something about Brian's eyes. They didn't belong to a liar. They belonged to someone who had seen more than he would ever talk about. Jenkins raised a hand timidly. Captain. With respect, sir. What if he isn't lying? The room fell silent. Dalton turned sharply. What did you say? Corporal Jenkins swallowed hard. I just mean, he noticed that radar issue earlier. Took our tech team half an hour to figure it out. Maybe he does know. Dalton cut him off with a raised hand. Corporal, are you suggesting this janitor knows more than my Marines? Jenkins looked down. No, sir. Just... He seemed to know something. Dalton's voice hardened. He's a janitor. Period. Then he turned back to Brian, eyes cold, with the need to reassert dominance. You know what I think, Hale? I think you're one of those men who reads a few action novels and starts imagining himself as some kind of silent killer. Let me guess. Your secret code name was what? Shadow Wolf. Iron Talon. Something dramatic. He laughed again. Brian's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. Dalton wanted him angry, wanted him humiliated. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Brian simply said, I don't talk about the past. That's all. Dalton wasn't finished. No, see, that's the problem. Men like you hide behind mystery because the truth is boring. He raised his voice, making sure every Marine heard clearly. Brian Hale is a liar. The words echoed loud, deliberate, cruel. A flush of shame washed over the room, but not toward Brian. Toward Dalton. Jenkins watched Brian carefully, eyebrows pinched. He couldn't look away from the older man's eyes. They carried too much weight, too much history. No liar had eyes like that. Dalton wasn't done humiliating him. Tell you what he said, dramatically stepping closer. Why don't you prove it? Tell this room one thing. Just one that proves you ever served. Brian stared at the floor for a long moment. Not because he didn't have answers, but because every answer hurt. Every memory came with a price. Finally, he looked at Dalton. I'm not here to prove anything to you. Dalton grinned triumphantly. Exactly what I thought. Nothing to say. Nothing real. Just stories. Brian turned back to his cleaning cart. Some Marines laughed again, but softer, less certain now. Something about the exchange didn't feel like victory. It felt like a man punching fog, hitting nothing, proving nothing. As Brian walked toward the door, Dalton called after him. Next time you want to pretend you're one of us, remember janitors don't get medals. Brian paused. Just one heartbeat. Then he pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway. He didn't look back, not once. But a tremor ran through the room, a subtle, quiet shift. Somewhere deep in their chests, several young Marines felt a strange, unsettling thought rise up. What if he isn't lying, and for the first time? Captain Henry Dalton felt the slightest hint of doubt. A whisper, a ghost of uncertainty. one that would soon grow into something far greater, something he would never forget. The afternoon sun cast long amber stripes across the polished floors of Norfolk Tactical Center, turning every reflective surface into a quiet reminder of discipline and precision. Marines hurried through the corridors, with purpose equipment, rattling radios, buzzing voices crisp with urgency. And then there was Brian Hale, moving with none of that noise, none of that rush. He pushed his mop bucket down the hallway with slow, steady steps, blending into the background like he'd done for months. But inside him, something stirred. Dalton's words still echoed faintly, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that reminded him how fragile truth could be in a room full of arrogance. He paused briefly at a window overlooking the airstrip jets, lined up in the evening light wings, gleaming like silent guardians. His eyes softened. These machines, these symbols of power, he'd once known them intimately. Not anymore. He turned away. Just as he approached Simulation Control Room 2A, he heard the familiar digital hum of active systems being tested. Young technicians were clustered around monitors, adjusting frequencies, and syncing modules for the evening training session. Then he heard it. A faint blip. Wrong. Off rhythm. Brian stopped. He tilted his head slightly, listening not with his ears, but with instinct, sharpened over years of surviving moments where the slightest anomaly meant life or death. A radar signature was misaligned. Again. His brows drew together. He stepped quietly toward the doorway. Inside, Captain Dalton stood with 3 Marines reviewing the upcoming combat simulation on a large wall display. The tactical overlay flickered with red and blue units tracing predicted movement. Dalton's voice was sharp. Tonight's simulation is a blindside contact drill. We'll track hostile signatures approaching low altitude from the west. You will adjust countermeasures based on the radar's sweep pattern. Understood, yes, sir, the Marines answered. Brian hesitated. He didn't want another confrontation. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But he couldn't ignore the error, not when he knew exactly what it meant. He stepped into the doorway. One of your sweep cycles is duplicating ghost signals, he said, quietly. The room turned. Dalton slowly faced him, disbelief etched across his features. You again. Brian kept his tone even. Look at the lower left quadrant. The blips are duplicating every 4.2 seconds. That's a signal ghost from a miscalibrated echo return. If you run the simulation like this, your readings will be off by 15 degrees. One Marine instinctively checked the screen. His eyes widened. Captain, he's right. Dalton shot him a glare. I didn't ask you. He marched toward Brian. Didn't we already cover this? You don't belong in this room. You don't speak in this room. Brian kept his gaze calm. You're about to run a faulty simulation. Dalton stepped toe-to-toe with him. Are you challenging my authority again? No, Brian answered quietly. I'm warning you. The room went still. There was something different in his voice, not defiant, not prideful. Something deeper. Something that carried weight. Sergeant Lewis, standing behind Dalton, swallowed hard. Captain, maybe we should check it just in case. Dalton ignored him. A slow, mocking smile formed. You think just because you saw something once in some action movie, you understand radar systems. Brian didn't blink. I didn't learn this from a movie. Dalton scoffed loudly. Oh, right. Special operations? Was it? Maybe you used magic powers to detect it. The Marines laughed nervously, less certain now, but unwilling to cross their captain. Brian turned, slightly nodding toward the console. Run a diagnostic. You'll see. Dalton stepped forward, voice low and cutting. If you don't walk out of this room in the next 3 seconds, I'll... But he didn't get to finish, because suddenly the console beeped, sharp, insistent. The technician gasped. "Captain." The echo return is miscalibrated, exactly like he said. The room froze. Dalton's jaw tightened, his pride cracking like old glass. He turned slowly toward the screen, confirming what Brian had just told them. Then he spun back, eyes full of restrained fury. "You think this proves anything?" Dalton hissed. "You think finding a glitch makes you somebody?" Brian shook his head lightly. "No. It just means your team won't train with faulty data. Nothing more." Something in his calmness infuriated Dalton even further. Arrogant men hated quiet men. They couldn't control them, couldn't predict them, couldn't break them. Dalton jabbed a finger at him. "You stay out of my training. You hear me? If I catch you interfering again, I'll see to it that you're removed from this base entirely." Brian's eyes hardened. Removed. He thought of Harper waiting at home, drawing pictures for him, asking him whether he liked her new story about the brave raccoon. He thought of the life he had built, small, fragile, but peaceful. "I don't want trouble," Captain Brian said softly. "I never did." Dalton stepped closer, lowering his voice but sharpening it like a blade. "Then keep your janitor eyes on the floor where they belong." Brian nodded once and stepped back. But before he left, he looked at the radar screen again. The flicker now corrected the sweep, smooth, accurate. "Good luck with the drill," he said quietly. And then he walked out. Not because he feared Dalton, but because he feared what would happen if he stayed. As the door closed, Sergeant Lewis muttered under his breath, "Sir, with all due respect, that man didn't look wrong." Dalton's jaw worked, muscles tightening. "I don't care what he looked like," he snapped. "He's a janitor, and tomorrow everyone will remember that." But as he spoke, his words rang hollow even to him, because deep down in the quiet corner of his mind, he tried so hard to ignore. A single unwelcome truth whispered, "That man isn't who he says he is." And for the first time, doubt crept into Captain Henry Dalton's heart. By the time Brian Hale left the Norfolk Tactical Center that evening, the winter sun had already dipped below the horizon. The sky carried that muted blue-gray color that only coastal Virginia knew, soft, cold, and strangely comforting. He walked with quiet, deliberate steps toward his old pickup truck. Its paint faded its engine, humming with a loyal but weary rattle. He liked driving home at this hour. The world felt slower. People didn't shout. Everyone was tired enough to be human. He turned left out of the base gate, following the familiar road lined with pine trees, their branches swaying in the cold wind. For the first time that day, he exhaled fully. Dalton's voice, the laughter of those Marines, the radar screen glitch, the flash of a past he kept buried. It all swirled together in a fog he wished would lift. But at least he was going home. Home meant one thing now, Harper. Harper Hale was 8 years old and already had more imagination than most adults Brian knew. When he stepped through the front door of their small 2-bedroom home, she was sitting cross-legged on the rug, crayons scattered everywhere, drawing something intensely. As soon as she looked up, her eyes lit with pure joy. Daddy Brian felt something inside him soften. This was the only place in the world where he never had to pretend. He kneeled as she ran into his arms, hugging him with the force of someone who believed hugs were a form of magic. "Long day?" she asked, pulling back just enough to read his face. He smiled gently. "A bit. You look tired." "I'm okay," he said. And he was, now. Dinner was simple grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Harper talked the whole time about school, about her friend Lily, about how she wanted to build a spaceship out of cardboard boxes this weekend. Brian listened with the kind of attentiveness he never had the luxury of giving in his old life. After dinner, Harper followed him into the kitchen as he rinsed plates. "Daddy," she began, voice softer. "Now, can I ask you something?" Brian froze internally. Whenever she used that tone, It was rarely an easy question. "Of course," he said. She hesitated, fidgeting with the sleeve of her pink sweater. "What? What did you do before you became a janitor?" Brian's chest tightened. He kept rinsing the plate in his hands, letting the warm water run over his fingers as he decided how to answer. "I worked in the military," he said. I know she said. "But what did you do there?" "People at school say soldiers fight." But her eyes lifted to his with an honesty only a child possessed. "You don't seem like someone who hurts people." Brian swallowed. "I tried not to," he murmured. She stepped closer, small hand resting on his arm. "Did something bad happen?" He closed his eyes. For a moment he was thousands of miles away. Heat shimmering off desert sand, gunfire slicing the air, the weight of a fallen teammate in his arms, the metallic smell of blood, the ringing silence after explosions, the faces of men he saved, the faces of men he failed to save. When he opened his eyes, Harper was still there, still hoping for an answer. "There were things I had to do," he said quietly. "Things I wish never had to be done. But they were my responsibility. Is that why you don't talk about it?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, because some memories don't make good stories." Harper thought about that, her small brows furrowing in the same way her mother used to. Then she gently wrapped her arms around him. "I don't need to know everything," she whispered. "I just want you to be happy now." Brian felt something warm break through the heaviness inside him. He hugged her back, firm but tender. "I'm happy," he said, "because I have you." Later that night, after Harper was tucked into bed with her stuffed dolphin, Brian sat alone at the small dining table. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He opened a box he kept hidden on the highest shelf of the closet. Inside lay pieces of a life he never intended to revisit. A faded photograph of his unit, 8 men standing shoulder to shoulder, dust on their boots, smiles forced but proud. A bronze pin shaped like a falcon in flight, his team's insignia. A folded letter with worn creases from too many rereadings. The letter. He held it for a long moment before opening it. "To the man who saved us." His throat tightened. He remembered the young soldier who wrote it, trembling, bleeding but alive because Brian had carried him for nearly 2 miles under fire. That soldier didn't survive 2 weeks later. Brian folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the box. Then he reached the last item, a small leather tag stamped with 2 words, "Ghost Falcon." He stared at it. His past stared back. A part of him wanted to throw the whole box away, bury it, burn it. Another part knew he couldn't not, because he was proud, but because forgetting was its own kind of betrayal. He closed the box and slid it back where it belonged. As he turned off the light, he thought of Dalton, of the mocking words, the accusations, the disbelief. He wondered how much longer he could stay silent. But then a soft voice drifted from the hallway. Daddy Harper stood rubbing her eyes. Brian knelt beside her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" She leaned into him. "I had a dream you left." He lifted her gently into his arms. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured into her hair. And that was the truth he clung to. Whatever he had been, whatever ghosts haunted him. This little girl was the reason he stayed quiet, the reason he stayed alive, the reason he stayed. As he carried her back to bed, a thought whispered through the silence. Tomorrow would be harder. He didn't know how, he just felt it. And he was right. Morning at Norfolk Tactical Center broke with a heavy sky, thick clouds rolling in from the Atlantic, casting the entire base in a muted gray. It felt colder than usual, though maybe that was just the mood that had taken root ever since the incident in Simulation Room 2A. Brian Hale arrived early as always. The halls were quiet, peaceful. His boots made soft, steady taps against the floor, a rhythm that reminded him everything could still be simple. At least until the world decided otherwise. He had just finished wiping down the observation deck railings when the first wave of Marines came in. Their conversations echoed through the hall, sharp, excited, restless. Something was different today. Something electric. He sensed it before he heard it. "Did you hear Dalton's running a verification session today? He's gonna make the janitor talk. No way. The guy doesn't even look up when Dalton yells at him. Well, Dalton's pissed. Really pissed." Brian kept wiping through the cloth stilled slightly in his hand. Verification session. He knew what that meant. Dalton wasn't done humiliating him. He wasn't surprised. He was tired. By mid-morning, Lecture Hall 4B was packed, far more Marines than usual. Too many. A crowd drawn not by duty, but by curiosity. The kind that always swarmed whenever a lion cornered a wounded animal. Or thought he had. Captain Henry Dalton stood at the front of the room, chin raised, jaw, locked hands, clasped behind his back. His uniform was immaculate. His eyes burned with the unmistakable fire of a man desperate to regain control. Brian entered quietly through the side door, pushing his cart. He didn't expect silence, but silence fell anyway. People stared, some with pity, some with expectation, some with thinly veiled anticipation of a spectacle. Dalton smirked when he saw him. "Well, look who decided to join us," Dalton announced loudly. "Perfect timing, Hale. I was just telling everyone about you." Brian paused, but only for a breath. "Captain," he greeted calmly. Dalton motioned dramatically toward the screen behind him. "We're discussing leadership credibility, and I thought what better example than a man who claims to have served in special operations." A ripple of whispers shot through the room. Dalton stepped closer. "Tell us, Hale," he said, folding his arms. "Which unit were you supposedly in again? Perhaps we all misheard last time." Brian said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. But Dalton misread silence as weakness always had. "Come now," Dalton prodded. "Surely the great soldier who corrected our radar knows how to speak for himself." A few Marines laughed uneasily. Corporal Jenkins, sitting in the third row, fidgeted. His eyes flicked between Brian and Dalton. Something inside him knew this wasn't right. Dalton circled Brian like a hawk. "Men, let me tell you something," Dalton said, pacing. "Our friend here has been spreading the idea that he's a former special operator, that he has expertise." He turned sharply. "Well, do you?" Brian stood still. "I did my part," he said softly. Dalton's laugh was sharp and mocking. "That answer again. You did your part. You expect us to believe that." He stepped closer, voice rising. "You're nothing but a janitor with a big imagination." A murmur ran through the room. Brian met Dalton's eyes, not defiantly, not angrily, but with a quiet, steady gaze that unsettled everyone watching. Captain Brian said evenly, "I told you before, I'm not here to prove anything." Dalton scoffed. Convenient. A man with no proof. Corporal Jenkins suddenly stood. "Captain, maybe we shouldn't." Dalton cut him off with a glare. "Sit down, Corporal." The boy obeyed reluctantly. Dalton turned back to Brian, voice growing louder. "Tell us about your heroic service, Hale. Tell us your unit, your rank, your missions. Anything." He paused, then added smugly, "Or better yet, prove you're not lying." Brian felt hundreds of eyes on him. Pressure, expectation, the old weight he thought he'd buried. But his past wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a story to entertain people who didn't care. It held blood, faces, pain. He shook his head gently. "No." Dalton's face reddened. "No, that's all you have." Brian didn't answer. Dalton slammed his hand on a desk. "You're a fraud." Whispers rippled wildly now. Jenkins clenched his fists in his lap, jaw tight. Dalton leaned in close, lowering his voice, but making sure everyone could hear. No man who served would stay silent like this. "You're afraid to be caught. That's all." Brian's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something older, deeper, something no one in that room recognized. Dalton straightened triumphantly, mistaking the silence for surrender. "Men," he announced, "this is what happens when someone pretends to be more than they are." Then he delivered the line that shifted the energy of the entire room. "He's not just lying, he's insulting every real soldier here." The room inhaled sharply. That cut deeper than any insult. Jenkins stood again, this time with conviction. "Captain." "That's enough," Dalton spun. "Corporal, I swear." "No, sir," Jenkins said, voice trembling but firm. "I saw him fix that radar. I saw the way he analyzed it. That wasn't luck. That wasn't guessing. That was training." A few Marines nodded subtly. Dalton's face tightened. "This corporal is one warning away from cleaning bathrooms for the rest of the year," he snapped. But the doubt had already spread. Among them. In the air. Even within Dalton himself. He turned back to Brian, desperate to regain control. "Last chance, Hale. Admit you lied." Brian lifted his chin slightly, the first visible shift in posture all morning. "I didn't lie," he said quietly. The room stilled. Dalton froze. Those 3 words were soft, but carried a weight none of them expected. More powerful than shouting, more honest than any speech, more dangerous than Dalton realized. Brian added only 3 more. "I don't boast." A ripple went through the room. No one could explain why, but something about the way he said it felt true. Dalton opened his mouth to retaliate, but the doors at the back of the room suddenly swung wide, striking the walls with a sharp, echoing crack. Every Marine snapped to attention instinctively. Every heart jumped, and Brian turned, breath stilled, because standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh fluorescent lights, was a figure none of them expected. A woman in pristine white dress uniform, medals gleaming, presence overwhelming. Eyes scanning the room with a command that pulled the air tighter. Admiral Diana Brooks had arrived, and everything was about to change. For a moment, no one in Lecture Hall 4B moved. The doors, still trembling from the force with which they'd been pushed open, framed a tall, commanding figure. Admiral Diana Brooks stood in full dress, white's medals, perfectly aligned posture, straight as steel eyes, sharp enough to silence a room without saying a word. The Marines rose instantly. Admiral on deck, chairs scraped back, boots slammed to the floor, spines snapped straight. The air turned electric, charged with reverence, confusion, and a sudden suffocating awareness that whatever was about to happen would not be ordinary. Dalton's face drained of color. His bravado fell away like a cheap mask. "Admiral Brooks," he stammered, stepping forward. "Ma'am, we weren't expecting." But she didn't look at him, not even for a second. Her gaze locked onto Brian Hale. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened sharply, unmistakably. Her hand trembled just once. It was the kind of reaction no one expected from a 4-star Navy admiral known for breaking hardened commanders with a single sentence. Brian stood, frozen fingers still resting on the handle of his cleaning cart. Diana took 1 step forward, then another. Each footfall echoed like a slow, deliberate judgment. Dalton blinked, stunned. "Ma'am, he's just be quiet," Captain Diana said. Voice low but razor sharp. Dalton shut his mouth instantly. The room held its breath. Diana stopped barely 2 feet away from Brian. Her eyes softened in disbelief, in awe, in something far more personal than anyone in that room had expected. "Is it really you?" she whispered. Brian swallowed. hard. He hadn't heard that tone directed at him in years, one that carried respect, memory, and something dangerously close to emotion. She studied him. The long hair, the quiet eyes, the weight he carried in his shoulders. Ghost Falcon, she breathed. It wasn't loud, but it might as well have been a bomb. Gasps erupted. Hands flew to mouths. Marines looked at each other suddenly, pale, suddenly, uncertain, suddenly aware that they had been treating someone very, very different from a janitor. Dalton staggered back as if struck. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible." Diana snapped her eyes to him with a fury that could freeze blood. "Captain Dalton," she said. Voice clipped. "Do you understand who you just insulted?" Dalton opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Diana turned back to Brian, her expression tightening with something like regret. "We thought you were dead." Brian's eyes flickered a storm behind calm waters. "I tried to be," he said quietly. A pain passed across her face, brief but devastating. She straightened, pulling herself back into the stern, unshakable presence expected of a Navy admiral. But her voice softened in a way that made the entire room lean in. "Permission to speak freely. Ghost Falcon?" she asked. Brian exhaled, barely nodding. Permission granted. The Marines watched in stunned silence. They knew the name Ghost Falcon. Everyone with clearance knew it. The legend of a special operations tactician who had saved 73 lives on a mission considered impossible. A man who vanished without ceremony afterward. A man whose record was sealed under classified level Omega. And that man had been mopping their floors. Dalton felt his knees weaken. "Admiral," he stammered. "May I just clarify, he told us he—" Diana turned sharply, eyes blazing. "Captain Dalton," she said, "you stood here, in front of your Marines, and called a national hero a liar." Dalton swallowed face white. "Ma'am, I didn't know." "You didn't ask," she corrected. "You assumed. You mocked. You dismissed a man whose sacrifice you are not worthy to comprehend." A murmur rose, but quickly died, as she cut her gaze across the room. She looked back at Brian. Then slowly, Diana Brooks, 4-star Admiral steel backbone of the Atlantic Fleet woman, known for never bending under pressure, raised her hand and saluted him. A crisp, precise salute, held with reverent stillness. The kind of salute given only to warriors who had earned the impossible. The Marines stared, stunned to silence. Some felt chills. Some blinked rapidly, holding back unexpected emotion. Brian stood very still. Then, with a quiet dignity that felt heavier than any military ceremony, he returned the salute, but only halfway. A gesture not of equal rank, but of deep respect. Diana's jaw tensed. She lowered her hand slowly. She stepped closer. Voice hushed enough for only him and the front row to hear. "I knew you were alive," she whispered. "Something in me always knew." Brian looked down for just a moment. "Sometimes, I wish you hadn't." A flicker of hurt crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. Dalton stood stiff, sweating, his entire worldview collapsing like a house of cards. Diana straightened fully. To everyone in this room, she announced, voice ringing with authority, "Remember this moment. Because today you learned that greatness does not always wear rank." She looked at Brian again, and this time, the unspoken history between them glimmered beneath the surface. "Welcome back, Ghost Falcon," she said softly. Brian said nothing, but the entire room felt his silence. It was the silence of a man who had once carried the weight of lives on his shoulders, and the silence of a man who had no idea how much more was about to return. For several long seconds, the lecture hall remained frozen. No one dared breathe. No one dared move. The air felt almost sacred, as if an invisible line had been crossed, revealing a truth none of them were prepared for. Admiral Diana Brooks stood shoulder to shoulder with a janitor. Yet somehow, she looked smaller, humbler in his presence. Brian Hale, Ghost Falcon, held her gaze with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown all day. But there was something different in his eyes now. A depth, a history, a weight that could no longer be hidden. Captain Henry Dalton looked as if the floor had dropped out beneath him. His mouth hung open, his Adam's apple bobbing helplessly as he struggled to swallow the reality in front of him. The Marines whispered among themselves, voices trembling with awe. That's him. 73 lives. He was right here this whole time. He didn't say a word. One Marine actually took a step back, as though looking at Brian too closely might reveal something terrifying. Diana slowly shifted her attention from Brian to the room. Her voice came low, controlled, but laced with controlled fury. For those of you who weren't listening the first time, she said Ghost Falcon isn't a myth. He isn't a rumor. He isn't a story we tell in strategy courses. She stepped forward. He is real. And he is standing right in front of you. Silence. Complete reverent silence. Dalton's face flushed red, then white, then red again. He opened his mouth, trying desperately to reclaim command of the room. Admiral Brooks, with respect, if I had known Diana, held up a hand. The entire room flinched, as if she'd drawn a weapon. Captain Dalton, she said, before you humiliate yourself further, allow me to educate you. She turned sharply toward Brian. Ghost Falcon is the man who saved 73 service members during the Phoenix Shield collapse. The man who stayed behind enemy lines for 30 hours with a shattered radio. The man who dragged 2 wounded soldiers through live fire while he himself was injured. Her voice trembled, but not from weakness, from memory. Your simulations, your drills, your textbooks, those exist because of people like him. Dalton's knees wobbled. He steadied himself on a desk. The young Marine stared at Brian with something that bordered on worship. Diana's voice sharpened. And you called him a liar. Now Dalton truly couldn't breathe. Ma'am, he whispered, barely audible. I didn't know. That is the problem, Diana cut in. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You didn't respect the possibility that someone might be more than what you assumed. Her gaze hardened. And you didn't respect the uniform you wear. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Dalton staggered backward, words trembling as they fell from him. I'm sorry. I swear, I'm sorry. Brian Sir Hale Ghost. I didn't. Brian raised a hand lightly. And just like that, the room fell silent. He stepped toward Dalton, not intimidating, not confrontational, simply present. His expression softened just slightly, not with pity, but with understanding. Captain, he said quietly, ego kills faster than bullets. Dalton's breath hitched. Brian continued, voice steady, almost fatherly. Every soldier eventually learns the difference between pride and honor. One destroys, the other guides. Dalton's eyes watered, his voice cracked. I was arrogant and wrong. Brian placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was gentle, unthreatening, but it carried more weight than any reprimand. What matters is that you learn, Brian said. Dalton looked at him stunned. No rage, no humiliation, no desire for revenge, just grace. It broke him. Dalton bowed his head, shoulders trembling, in front of his Marines, in front of his superior, in front of the man he'd insulted. And somehow, it wasn't shameful. It was human. Brian gave his shoulder one more reassuring pat, then stepped back. The Marines watched with wide, unblinking eyes. Some swallowed hard, unsure whether they'd witnessed something sacred or unbearably personal. Diana inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She approached Brian again, not as an admiral, not as a superior officer, but as someone who had waited far too long for a moment like this. Her voice softened to a tone no one had ever heard from her. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "All these years. We thought you were one of the ones we lost." Brian's eyes lowered. I was lost. A flicker of grief crossed her face, a flicker of relief, too. She nodded, breath quivering, then without hesitation took one step back and lifted her hand once more. A second salute. But this one was not protocol, not rank to rank, not military formality. This was personal. A salute to a man she believed dead. A man who had quietly saved lives long after life had stopped giving him peace. A man who returned, not with medals or speeches, but with a mop and a quiet soul. The room stood in absolute silence. Brian returned the salute again, soft, humble, reserved, almost painful. When their hands lowered, Diana turned to the room. "I want every Marine in this hall to remember what you witnessed today," she commanded. "You do not measure a warrior by his uniform, or by his rank, or by his appearance." Her voice rose, echoing through the hall like thunder. "You measure a warrior by his sacrifice." Every Marine snapped straighter. No one would ever forget this moment. Diana looked at Brian one last time before turning away. But something unspoken remained between them, a history. Only they understood a history that would unravel soon enough. Dalton watched her leave trembling. The room remained still long after she disappeared into the hallway. Brian took a slow breath, gripping his cleaning cart again. His life of anonymity was gone. Something had been awakened, a truth impossible to bury again. As he stepped toward the door, Marines instinctively parted for him, standing at attention as he passed. Reverence, respect, awe. But Brian felt none of it, only the weight of a past he never wanted to carry again. The lecture hall emptied slowly after Admiral Diana Brooks's stunning arrival, leaving behind a silence thick enough to feel. Some Marines lingered in the doorway, whispering, still stealing glances at Brian Hale, as though he might vanish into vapor if they blinked. But Brian didn't vanish. He simply picked up his cleaning cart and rolled it to the corner, quiet as ever. Diana hadn't gone far. She stood near the front of the room, her eyes fixed on the tactical screens that still glowed against the wall. After a long, steady breath, she turned toward Brian. "Ghost Falcon," she said softly. "May I have a moment?" He looked at her, studying the tension in her expression. She was composed, controlled, but he could see it, the weight behind her eyes. She was trying to hold together decades of memory and responsibility. He gave a small nod. Dalton, still pale and stiff, stepped aside quickly as Diana approached the center of the room. "Men," she said firmly to the remaining Marines, "take your seats." The order came unexpected, but none dared question it. Within seconds, every Marine sat upright, eyes front, as if a surprise inspection had just begun. Even Captain Dalton took a seat in the front row, jaw tight, breath shallow. Diana turned to Brian. "Would you," she asked gently, "share something with them? Anything you're willing to give?" Brian stiffened. This wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't here to be admired. He wasn't here to teach. He was here to survive the day, go home, and make sure Harper had a warm dinner and help with her reading assignment. But he looked at the faces in front of him. Young, uncertain, eager. Faces that reminded him of men he once knew. Men he couldn't save. Diana saw the hesitation and lowered her voice. "Just a lesson," she whispered. One lesson that might keep them alive. Something inside him shifted. Not pride. Responsibility. Slowly, Brian walked toward the main tactical console. Dalton jumped up to give him room. The screens towered in front of him. Blue grids, red markers, blinking signatures tracing movement patterns. With a touch of his hand, the system responded instantly as if recognizing him. The Marines leaned forward. Brian didn't turn to face them. He spoke while studying the display, calm, controlled, almost clinical, but with an undercurrent of emotion he didn't try to hide. "War isn't about firepower," he said. "It's about perception." A quiet settled over the room. He tapped a section on the radar overlay. "This," he continued, "is the blind spot in most simulations. It's where the enemy hides their actual movement. Not where you think they are, but where they want you to think they are." He zoomed in, highlighting faint signatures almost invisible on the screen. "You see these faint returns?" he asked. Several Marines squinted, shaking their heads. "You're not supposed to," Brian said. "That's why they work." Dalton swallowed hard. Brian continued, switching to a split-screen view that revealed a more complex pattern. "Shadow split," he said. "We developed it during a mission where we were outnumbered 20-1. It divides friendly signatures into 2 decoys and 1 real trail. The enemy wastes ammunition on the illusions." A Marine raised his hand timidly. "Sir?" "How did you create it?" Brian paused. "Out of desperation," he answered. "And because men were going to die if I didn't." That answer hit the room like a quiet earthquake. He moved to another section of the simulation, this one showing heat signatures blending with terrain. "Your enemy watches your movement through heat. Light sound pattern recognition. You beat them by thinking like them. You disappear into the things they ignore." Diana watched him with a mix of awe and heartbreak. Brian tapped in several commands until the screen displayed an old mission layout, classified, but simplified enough for teaching. This, he said, was a foothill zone near the border. "My team walked into an ambush at 200 hours. Dalton's eyes widened. Brian continued, voice steady but softer. Now, no storytelling flourish, no dramatics, just raw truth. "I used the terrain's temperature variance to hide 2 of my men under thermal shadows created by the rocks. Then we used the sound of distant artillery. American artillery to mask our movement." One Marine whispered, "How is that even possible?" Brian looked at him. "It shouldn't have been," he said quietly. "But sometimes the impossible is the only option left." He switched to a final simulation. The markers showed 1 blue dot surrounded by dozens of red ones. Dalton whispered, "That's you." Brian didn't answer. Instead, he addressed the room. "You will all face moments where the books don't help you, where your training doesn't cover what's happening, where fear will be screaming louder than any order you've ever been given." He stepped away from the console and finally faced them. "And in that moment, you will have to decide what kind of soldier you want to be." No one spoke. He continued. "War isn't won by the strongest men, or the smartest, or the fastest." The pause lingered. "It's won by the men who understand people, their fears, their instincts, their breaking points. If you understand people, you understand the battlefield." His voice deepened. "The battlefield is human. Always human." A Marine in the second row wiped his eyes discreetly. Another whispered, "My God." Diana stood very still, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her shoulders trembling ever so slightly. Brian's final words fell across the room like a prayer and a warning all at once. Bravery isn't running into fire. It's knowing you might lose everything and moving anyway. Silence, deep, heavy, reverent. Then slowly, a single Marine began to clap. Another followed, and another, until the entire room erupted into applause, thunderous, emotional, overwhelming. Dalton clapped, 2 tears trembling on his lashes. Diana closed her eyes for a brief moment, the applause washing over her like something she'd been waiting years to hear again. Brian stood still, absorbing none of the praise. He wasn't performing. He wasn't proving anything. He was, finally, simply telling the truth. And the truth had changed everything. The applause faded slowly, leaving behind a charged stillness that seemed to cling to the air like mist after a storm. The Marines remained seated, many still wide-eyed, unsure what to do with the emotions swirling inside them. Brian Hale stood quietly near the console, hands folded loosely in front of him. He had seen battlefields fall silent the same way, after the last shot, after the last scream. Only the echo of what had happened remained. Admiral Diana Brooks had stepped aside to regain her composure. Her back was straight, her jaw tight, but the shine in her eyes betrayed what she was fighting to hold down. Pride, pain, gratitude, memory. And then there was Captain Henry Dalton. He hadn't moved, not once. He sat stiffly in the front row, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like a man trying to hold himself together before he broke completely. As the last Marine exited the room, Dalton finally stood. But he didn't stand like an officer. He stood like a man stripped down to the truth. He walked toward Brian with slow, uncertain steps, each one heavier than the last. When he reached him, he stopped trying to find his voice. It came out fractured. "Sir." Brian looked at him, calm, unreadable. Dalton swallowed. "Before anything else, I need to say I'm ashamed." His voice trembled not from fear of rank, but from guilt. Deep, honest guilt. "I was arrogant," he admitted, "and loud. And I mocked you because I thought your quiet made you less." Brian said nothing. Dalton's eyes glistened as he forced himself to continue. "I insulted you. I humiliated you. I called you a liar in front of my men. I dragged your name through the mud without knowing a single thing about you." He drew in a shaky breath. "I thought strength meant volume, presence, command. But you..." He shook his head, overwhelmed. "You showed me today that real strength is something else entirely." Brian's expression softened. Not pity, not triumph. Understanding. Dalton took a long breath, then straightened out in a show of military posture, but in sincerity. "Sir, with every ounce of honesty I have, I'm sorry." The words hung between them, raw, vulnerable, unguarded. Brian let the silence settle, not uncomfortable, just deliberate. Then he stepped closer, placing a steady hand on Dalton's shoulder. Captain Brian said gently, "The uniform doesn't make the man. The man makes the uniform. And every one of us learns the hard way." Dalton blinked, fighting the emotion rising in his throat. Brian continued, "Ego kills faster than bullets. I learned that once." A distant shadow flickered in his eyes. "Maybe you're learning it now." Dalton nodded, breathing unevenly. "I deserved that. And more." "No," Brian answered softly. "You deserve the chance to grow. That's enough." For a moment, Dalton couldn't speak. Then he did something no one expected. He removed his cover, the symbol of his rank, and bowed his head. Sir Dalton whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on men like me." Brian's jaw tightened. His voice dropped low, almost a hum. "We all fall short, Captain. What matters is what you do after." Dalton wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't hiding. He was changing. And that change settled into the air like the first snow of winter, quiet, profound, transformative. Admiral Diana Brooks approached, then her steps careful as though the moment between the two men was something fragile she didn't want to break. "Captain Dalton," she said evenly. Dalton snapped to attention, though there was a softness in him that hadn't been there before. "Ma'am." Diana regarded him for a moment. "Leadership isn't about being right. It's about being willing to be wrong and learn." "Yes, ma'am," Dalton answered, voice steady again but changed. "I understand that now." Her expression eased. "Good. Because men who can admit they're wrong are men I trust far more than those who pretend they never are." Dalton's shoulders eased. "Thank you, Admiral." Diana turned to Brian, her voice dropping into something gentler. "You always had that effect on people," she said with a small, wistful smile. Brian looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "People change themselves. I just give them a nudge." Dalton cleared his throat, stepping back. "I'll leave you both," he said quietly. "But Brian, if you ever need anything, you come to me." Then with conviction, "You saved 73 men once. But today, I think you saved one more." He nodded deeply, then walked out of the room, shoulders squared, steps, different, lighter, but stronger. When the door closed, Diana exhaled a long, weary breath that revealed the weight she carried. "You all would have had a way with soldiers," she murmured. Brian leaned against the console, gently tired, in a way that wasn't physical. "I didn't want any of this," he said. "I know." Diana's eyes softened. "But truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, even when you bury it." He didn't answer. She stepped closer. "You didn't have to comfort him, you know. You owed him nothing." Brian considered her words. Then he shook his head. "I owe everyone something," he said quietly. "Because people showed me mercy once, when I didn't deserve it." Her eyes flickered recognition, empathy, a memory they shared, but hadn't spoken of yet. "You haven't changed," she whispered. "I've changed more than you think." But Diana shook her head softly. "No, you're still the man who refuses to let broken things stay broken." Brian didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. They stood together in silence, two lives intertwined by a past heavy enough to crush most men. Finally, Diana stepped back. "Rest now," she urged. "This isn't over. Tomorrow, decisions will be made." Brian nodded. He knew. And despite his calm exterior, despite the quiet strength that defined him, he felt something echo in his chest. A shift, a warning, a truth. Tomorrow would change everything. Again. The morning after the revelation was colder than usual. A crisp, biting wind blew in from the Atlantic, carrying with it the smell of salt and the sound of distant gulls. Norfolk Tactical Center looked the same as always. Gray walls, uniformed personnel marching across the courtyard, engines of transport vehicles humming in the distance. But something felt different. Something had shifted. Brian Hale sensed it before he even reached the building. People didn't just glance at him anymore. They watched him with quiet reverence. Conversations paused when he walked by. A few Marines straightened reflexively, as if unsure whether they should salute. He kept his gaze down, hands wrapped around the handle of his cleaning cart. He didn't want this attention. He didn't ask for it. He wasn't ready for it. He just wanted to do his job, finish his shift, and go home to Harper. But life had never asked Brian what he wanted. Inside the briefing room, Admiral Diana Brooks stood with a small group of senior officers. The atmosphere was stiff, yet buzzing. Maps were spread across the table, operational charts, strategic assessments, projections of newly emerging threats. But all eyes drifted to Brian the moment he stepped inside. He hesitated, unsure why he'd been called here. He wasn't supposed to be in rooms like this anymore. Diana looked up and dismissed the officers with a lift of her hand. "Give us the room." Within seconds, they left, some nodding respectfully to Brian on their way out. Once the door closed, silence settled between him and the Admiral. Diana approached him slowly, her expression caught somewhere between pride and pain. "Ghost Falcon," she began, then paused, correcting herself gently. "Brian," he nodded. She drew a steady breath. "We need you." Brian looked down, uncomfortable. "Diana." "I'm not that man anymore." Her eyes softened, but her voice held steel. "You think heroes get to decide when they stop being needed?" He didn't answer. Diana stepped closer, her voice dropping into something more personal. The Navy has kept a position open for nearly a decade. Tactical Chief of Advanced Operations. It was yours. It was always meant for you. Brian flinched internally. He knew that role. He knew what it meant. Responsibility. Command. Sacrifice. He swallowed hard. Why now? She exhaled slowly, rubbing her thumb over the edge of her uniform hat. Because threats are evolving faster than our younger strategists can adapt. A pause. And because some minds are irreplaceable. He didn't like hearing that. He didn't want to be irreplaceable. Diana's voice softened again. You saw the radar glitch before the technicians did. You saw the split patterns, the decoy dynamics. That's not just training. That's intuition shaped by war. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't want to remember. Diana continued. Your instincts could save lives again. That was the problem. Saving lives came with losing others. And Brian had lost enough. He stepped back, shaking his head gently. I have a daughter, he said. Diana nodded as though she'd expected that answer. I know. Harper? There was warmth in her voice, almost affectionate. I've heard wonderful things about her. Brian looked away, overwhelmed. She needs me. She needs a father who's present, not someone who disappears into classified missions. Diana's face faltered. Pain flickered in her eyes. I remember, she whispered. I remember what that life demands. I remember what it took from you. He heard unspoken names, unspoken losses. Brian drew a slow breath. I can't go back. Not to that world. Not ever. Diana stepped closer, voice breaking through the last of her composure. You're one of the greatest minds the tactical division ever had. Losing you once nearly crippled us. Losing you again. Her voice wavered. It's something I don't want to face. Brian looked into her eyes, and for the first time in years he saw not the Admiral, but the woman who had once stood beside him on missions, who had trusted him with her life, who had delivered the news of his team's deaths with shaking hands. The woman who had mourned him. He gently rested a hand on her arm. Diana, I'm honored. Truly. But my mission now is Harper. She closed her eyes tightly as though fighting back emotion. You always were a stubborn man, she whispered. Someone has to be, he replied softly. When she opened her eyes again, there was a sheen of tears. She quickly blinked away. She squared her shoulders, returning slowly, painfully to the role of Admiral. If this is your choice, she said, voice steady but quiet, then it will be respected. He nodded once. She turned away briefly, gathering her discipline like a shield, but before he could leave, she faced him again, expression softer than he had ever seen it. One request, she said. A moment of ceremony. He frowned lightly. Diana. But she was already lifting her hand, a crisp, formal salute. Not for rank, not for duty, not for sadness, but for honor. Brian swallowed. His throat tightened. Slowly he returned her salute. It was the last salute they would ever exchange as soldiers. And they both knew it. Outside the building, the wind had grown sharper. Brian walked toward the parking lot, feeling the weight lift from him, even as a different weight settled on his shoulders. A decision made. A future chosen. Not for glory. Not for a uniform. For Harper. As he approached his truck, footsteps echoed behind him. Sir Brian turned. Dalton jogged up, slightly out of breath, determination burning in his eyes. Sir, I heard about the offer, Dalton said. The tactical chief role. Brian didn't ask how he knew. Word traveled fast on a military base. Dalton drew breath, steadying himself. I just wanted to say, whatever choice you made, I know it was the right one. Brian studied him. Really studied him. Dalton wasn't the same man he'd met a few days earlier. Something fundamental in him had changed. Brian nodded. "Thank you, Captain." Dalton saluted him, not out of obligation but respect, then stepped back. Brian climbed into his truck, started the engine, and glanced once more at the base buildings in the rearview mirror. He didn't regret his choice. He had spent a lifetime being a soldier. Now he would spend the rest being a father. And that, he believed, was the braver path. The sun was dipping low over Norfolk by the time Brian Hale finished his shift. The sky glowed with hues of gold and amber, the kind of colors that felt soft on the soul. The wind had calmed. The air was quiet. As he stepped out of the service wing, carrying nothing more than a rolled-up floor towel and the soft echo of the day behind him, something felt different. Not in the painful way things had felt different these past few days. Different in a way he hadn't expected. Gentler. Fuller. He headed toward the long corridor that led to the main exit. It was always empty at this hour, a lonely stretch of tile and fluorescent light. Except today. Today someone was waiting. At the far end of the corridor stood a Marine corporal posture, straight eyes forward. The moment Brian approached, the Marine lifted his hand to his brow. A salute. Brian slowed. The young man didn't waver. "Sir," the Marine said quietly. "Thank you." Brian opened his mouth to speak, but the Marine had already stepped aside, giving Brian a respectful path forward. He walked in silence, moved in a way he couldn't quite process. But the corridor ahead was no longer empty. 2 more Marines stood at the next junction, both saluting him with solemn reverence. Men who had laughed earlier that week, who had doubted him, who had never looked at him for more than 2 seconds. Their salutes were not for Ghost Falcon. They weren't for medals, or missions, or whispered legends. They were for the man who had taught them something they didn't know they needed to learn. For the quiet hero they'd overlooked. Brian acknowledged their salutes with a small nod and continued forward. As he rounded the corner, he stopped in his tracks. The entire hallway was lined with Marines, dozens of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, straight, still, silent. Every single one saluted as Brian walked by. It wasn't loud. There were no speeches, no dramatic soundtrack, just the soft echo of boots aligning the quiet breath of disciplined lungs, the electric hum of respect filling the air like an unseen current. Brian's chest tightened, not with pride, with humility. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted recognition. He hadn't wanted his past to matter. But in that moment, he understood something profound. Sometimes the world doesn't honor you for what you did. It honors you for who you chose to become afterward. And Brian had chosen a quieter path, a gentler path, a path that most heroes never reached. As he moved down the hallway, each Marine's salute felt like a quiet acknowledgement of all the pain he had carried and never spoken about. The ghosts he lived with, the sacrifices he'd never named, the lives he saved, and the ones he couldn't. At the end of the hall stood Admiral Diana Brooks. She did not salute this time. She simply watched him with an expression that said everything words could not. Pain, pride, respect, and something more personal, something rooted in memories neither of them dared to touch yet. When Brian reached her, she stepped forward. "You deserve this," she said softly. He shook his head. "I don't know if I do." She held his gaze. "You do," she said with absolute conviction. "Not because of your missions, not because of Ghost Falcon, but because you chose a different kind of courage afterward." He looked down the hall again, at all those solemn faces, at the unexpected tribute that felt heavier than any medal. "This isn't easy for me," he murmured. "I know," she replied. "The truth never is." For a moment they stood as the world around them breathed quietly. Then Diana lifted her hand, not in salute, but in a gentle grounding gesture as she placed it briefly on his shoulder. "We'll be here if you ever choose to come back," she whispered. In any role, in any capacity, you belong to this family as much as you belong to your daughter. Brian's throat tightened. Thank you, Admiral, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. Call me Diana. You earned that right a long time ago. He nodded once. Then he stepped past her toward the exit doors. The last rays of sunlight spilled in through the glass, casting long shadows that danced over the hallway floor as he walked outside into the evening. His old pickup truck sat waiting for him, rusted and loyal. The moment he opened the driver's side door, a small voice called from across the lot. Daddy Harper came running, her little backpack bouncing behind her. Someone had dropped her off early from after-school care. She sprinted toward him with the full force of 8-year-old enthusiasm. Brian dropped to one knee and caught her in his arms. She hugged him tightly. You're late today. I know, he said, smoothing her hair. Had a long day. She pulled back to look at him. A good day. He considered that. Not simple, not peaceful, not quiet, but good. Yes, yes, he whispered. A good day. They walked to the truck hand in hand. Harper climbed in, buckled herself, and began telling him about her drawing project at school, about how she wanted to bring cookies for her class next week, about how she missed him. Brian listened, his heart full. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The Marines had dispersed. The building stood calm again. But something invisible lingered in the air, a sense of closure, a sense of respect, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the world understood him now. Brian drove home with his daughter's laughter filling the cab. He wasn't Ghost Falcon anymore. He wasn't a legend. He wasn't a warrior. He was something far greater. A father, a quiet hero. And for the first time in a long, long while, that was enough. Where are you watching from today? We always love hearing where our viewers are tuning in from. It reminds us how many kind hearts are gathered here, sharing these quiet, meaningful moments together. And if this story touched you, inspired you, or simply warmed your evening, we warmly invite you to join our channel. Your support helps us continue creating gentle healing stories about courage, kindness, and everyday heroes who still walk among us. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We appreciate you more than words can say. Until the next story, stay safe, stay blessed, and take good care of yourself and those you love.